Hi, everybody. I hope you like my, as I said, my musical accompaniment for these slides. I like to do this with a soundtrack. And right on cue. Oh, good. There you go. Perfect. I like a little beat. So let me start just by saying what a privilege it is to be here speaking with you. You know, all of the speakers here today and all of the exciting work that they're doing. I reviewed all of the projects that everyone proposed, and it's just really groundbreaking, exciting stuff. And I just hope that I can add something marginally useful to the discussion here today. It's great to be talking to you. So as Alexander said at the beginning, I'm from the GovLab. We are an action research organization based at New York University, founded by Beth Novak and Stefan Verhulst. Our mission is to improve people's lives by changing the way we govern, which is a big and broad mission. But we think about that in terms of two things that are essentially two new assets that are available to institutions, whether they be government, international organizations, et cetera, that are two new assets that are made more accessible as a result of technology. And one is people, so having more access to networked expertise and abilities among the populace. And the second one is, no surprise, data. So I'm going to be talking a little bit today about a project that we've been working on for a while that we like to call data collaboratives. So data collaboratives, you likely haven't heard that specific term before, but you know quite a bit about what we're talking about, because we've heard a lot about it today, and many of you are actually working on what we would term data collaboratives in your work now. So data collaboratives, from our perspective, is the idea that whenever actors from different sectors share their data, exchange data, they can solve problems in more effective ways. So I don't need to stand up here and tell you that data is important, that it can help drive decision making, or that more liquid data can be useful, that open data is a useful kind of movement and path forward. And in many rooms, I have to say, but I think in this room I don't have to say it, getting access to corporate data, sharing private sector data with institutions can help solve public problems as well. And I have to tell you that when we started this work, that was a little bit more of a controversial thing to say, and it's really wonderful to be in a room full of people who recognize this, and many people are working on it right now. So this concept of data collaboratives that we're working on is based on this exact idea, so that if we can find new ways and enable new ways for private sector entities to make their data more accessible to problem solvers in a really targeted way, in a problem-driven way, we can solve problems more effectively. Because as we all know, institutions, governments, international organizations hold a lot of data, collect a lot of data, a lot of useful data, but governments aren't collecting browsing histories, they aren't collecting call detail records. So much of the most useful data out there isn't automatically accessible to people trying to solve these public problems. So, we have a website, and I shared propaganda all around, so you can check it out. It's at datacollaboratives.org. And one of the things that we're doing there is collecting examples, because as we, again, see in this room, this is a growing field with quite a lot of activity. But we set out to just collect what's going on out there. What are the examples of this cross-sector data sharing? And when we started, I was hoping we'd find 15 or 20 examples. We launched the site with nearly 100, and adding more every day. So we have a couple here, tiny little type, unfortunately. Everything from sharing data across sectors to track illegal fishing, to improving energy access and solar, being able to target solar efforts around energy access, to tracking the spread of Ebola and dengue and other kind of health crises. So, and then we've heard many examples this morning. So again, I'm sorry, the type is a little bit small here, but whenever we talk about data collaboratives, and I'll say also before I jump into this, I don't think I'm adding too much new to the discussion based on what we've already heard, so much as putting a frame on it, because I think we've already seen the examples of what these kind of societal benefits that I'm going to talk about are. But just as a way to think about it a little bit, the way that we look at the kind of value that data collaboratives can create, there's 5 central ones that we would talk about. So there's the situational awareness and response. So sharing data to help, for example, using Twitter data to better understand where flood activity is happening. How can we improve our awareness of conditions on the ground? Public service design and delivery. So getting access to the data that can help us make smarter decisions about policy development or service delivery, target our efforts more effectively in the public sector. Knowledge creation and transfer. As I said, the private sector has a lot of information, knows quite a lot. How do we just move some of that knowledge over to the people trying to solve the problems? Can we do that through data sharing arrangements? Prediction and forecasting. So being able to predict where wheat rust is going to happen and then target interventions as a result of that. And then finally, impact assessment and evaluation. As we all know, tracking the impact of innovation interventions is incredibly difficult, and having another data source to pull from to determine whether things are working or not is always valuable. So in our research, so looking into the current field out there, we identified kind of 6 main types of data collaboratives of corporate data being shared to solve problems. So we see examples of cooperatives or pooling, where multiple entities all put their data together and then they can each draw from it for their own purposes. Prizes and challenges, examples of corporations making data accessible and saying, whoever can come up with the best use for our data, we're going to give you a monetary reward. And then all of those solutions are then available to the public. Research partnerships, we see a lot of examples of corporations making their data not openly accessible, not available through a platform online, but sharing it with a university or a research organization to say, what insight can you draw from our data that we're not going to be drawing from it because we're using it for business purposes alone. Intelligence products, we see in some cases, industry groups or corporations sharing more aggregated information to get a better sense of kind of broad trends, demographic information, market research trends. So not necessarily sharing individual data sets, but the larger insights that are drawn from those data sets. APIs, again, going to the Twitter example, being able to tap into kind of the fire hose of tweets to be able to inform some kind of analysis. And then trusted intermediaries. So this is where I'm thinking of places like DataKind or FlowMinder, where corporations might not share their call detail records with the government or with UNDP directly, but there are these other entities that might be able to broker these relationships and do the analysis that's needed on this data. Or in some cases, like we heard about FlowMinder this morning, examples where the trusted intermediary might bring the algorithm to the data. So the data doesn't necessarily have to change hands. Corporate data might not have to be made liquid, but instead an algorithm is brought to the data, insight is gained, and then we do some problem-solving effort based on that. So I hope you can all read this. Please take notes. So this is the methodology that we've developed from our designer. Not my designer. Our designer is going to be so disappointed when I tell him this. So the methodology that we developed here is based on both our kind of look at what's going on in the world, and it's also what we're testing out right now through a project that we have with UNICEF. So we're working with UNICEF to essentially create these kind of data collaboratives in a very problem-driven way. So we've had months of effort working with different missions around the world at UNICEF to say, what are the big problems that you're facing, and what are the data gaps that maybe if you start to cast a wider net and look across sectors, you might be able to fill some of those gaps. So we're looking at examples of using satellite imagery data to track internally displaced people in Somalia, to conducting sentiment analysis on social media data to get a better sense of what are the drivers of the high levels of C-sections in Brazil, and why is natural birth so rare? What are the sentiment kind of driving that to drivers of youth suicide in India, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the methodology. Again, you can't read it, but it is online. So if you want to take a post-lunch nap, that's okay too. We can talk through it in more detail. So essentially our methodology here is built around 8 major kind of phases and then 18 more detailed steps. And I'll talk very briefly about them. I don't want to take up too much time, but before I jump in, I do want to say that this is one approach. This is an approach that we built from looking at what's out there, and it's what we're testing. Christine talked about a different kind of approach this morning. This is not a more valid approach. This is just what we're doing. So the first thing that we talk about when establishing a data collaborative is getting a sense of the demand. Really understanding the problem that you want to solve, and that involves not only looking at what's the problem area, but getting so granular and kind of actionable that the opportunity really becomes clear. That includes getting a sense of who the beneficiaries are, what the assumptions are. The assumption that if we make this information on Hays available, kids are actually going to stay home from school and not go play football out in the yard and have an even worse outcome. To the counter arguments against this approach, et cetera, knock-on effects, unintended consequences, which we already talked about. Then, defining the value proposition. So this is the societal benefits that I was talking about before: situational awareness, knowledge creation and transfer, et cetera. Getting specific about what you actually think the data could do to solve this problem. Next, of course, since matching supply and demand, next is getting a sense of the supply, both internally, in your organization, in UNDP in this case, and what's out there in the world, what could be kind of brought to bear to try to address this problem or fill these data gaps. So we look at the supply side both in terms of expertise and of data. So for this UNICEF project, for example, UNICEF has some fantastic data scientists on staff, but we're also partnering with an organization called the ISI Foundation in Italy that has additional data science capacity that they're bringing to the project. So we're looking not only at what kind of data is available that could help solve this problem, but what kind of expertise is available and how do we broker those relationships to enable both the skills and the data to move around in an effective way. Next, of course, since they are data collaboratives, they naturally involve collaboration. So this is where we talk about, based on this understanding of the supply and the demand side, what's that arrangement that I talked about earlier? I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. So looking at the supply and the demand, who are the entities that might be the most useful to kind of be brought to the table in terms of their data capacity, their data, the data that they hold, or the expertise that they have and they could bring to the table. So, of course, the natural question there, whenever you're talking about incentive, when you're talking about getting the private sector involved in a public good effort, is what's the incentive? What's the incentive for a corporation to work with UNDP on a specific project? And looking again at our examples, I'll just touch on these very briefly. We see a number of incentives, we call them the 6 R's here, of reasons that corporations might enter into these kind of arrangements. So things like reciprocity. This is especially relevant for the kind of data cooperative model. One of my favorite examples of data collaboratives is this thing called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership, which is 10 pharmaceutical companies that all pool their data in the US. So one small portion of a pharmaceutical company's data. All of that is made accessible across these 10 organizations and then to the United States Food and Drug Administration and the National Institutes of Health, so that their research and development efforts can draw on all of this data. If you went to a pharmaceutical company and said, hey, make some of your data accessible, the answer is going to be no. If you say, make some of your data accessible and you'll get access to 9 of your competitors' data, then that's a conversation. So then we see data, revenue streams are another incentive sometimes. You might purchase some kind of access to the data. Research and insights, especially relevant for collaborations with universities or research organizations, of course. Regulatory compliance, examples where cleaning and making accessible and transparent data might help, a corporation adhere to some kind of regulatory requirements. Reputation boosting. It's nice to be able to put out a press release that says you're helping UNDP solve a big public problem. That's an incentive. And then responsibility. We like to talk about data collaboratives as a new form of corporate social responsibility, being able to help solve public problems. So then we talk about the design. This is where you decide on what the actual data sharing mechanism might be, what the data collaborative is going to look like. And then you also really need to start thinking about the risks, which we've already talked about a little bit. I'm not going to get into a long list of risks, but the way that we like to think about, and we encourage people to think about the risk cycle, is to think about it across the data life cycle. So a risk assessment shouldn't be a bunch of bullet points. It's thinking about, okay, what are the risks at the data collection stage? Well, we might collect dirty data. What are the risks at the sharing stage? Unauthorized people might gain access to it. What about the using stage? We might make a decision based on dirty data that was collected from the start. So that's getting a sense of how all of these different risks might bubble up at different stages of the data lifecycle, and how all of these risks might compound as you go across the data lifecycle, is a kind of a more nuanced way to get an understanding up front of what the unintended consequences of a data collaborative might be, and it will inform your risk mitigation strategy. That's another big step in this process. Also, as part of the design stage, we like to talk about establishing the terms and conditions for the data collaborative. Are you going to sign a memorandum of understanding, for example, between the groups, and then establishing a governance structure. What's the process for making decisions? What's the hierarchy? Who decides whether it's working or not, or if you need to go in a totally new direction? Then we get to the implementation stage, the fun part, of course. Here, it's important to start thinking about the roles and responsibilities. Who's going to do what as the collaborative goes on? What's the timeline? And then, of course, this is something that should be thought about earlier, but it becomes especially salient now. What's the funding model? How is this going to be sustained in the long term? Is it a kind of pro bono arrangement with the data holders? How is that going to work going forward? Communication, both kind of public-facing. What's the information you want to get out to the public about the data collaborative, about the work that you're doing, and also around the audience. Is the data collaborative aimed at a specific user base accessing this information? How do you get them? How do you make them aware of the opportunity here? And how do you identify additional partners that could be brought into the fold? So having that communication strategy from the start. I promise we're almost done. And then learning is the seventh phase, because of course, people often point to data and data-driven decision-making as a move from faith-based to evidence-based kind of policy making and policy interventions. But the kind of funny thing is that often data-driven projects aren't necessarily evidence-based themselves. So how do we kind of develop that baseline up front to understand what's the starting point whenever we implement this new data collaborative intervention, and then how do we measure progress against that initial baseline, and how do we do the impact assessment to determine, is this actually making a difference? And doing that right at the implementation stage so that you're understanding from the moment you're launching whether it's making an impact. And then finally, based on that learning that you've done, iterating as needed, or abandoning. If you have this access to the data on what the impact is, what difference has been made against the baseline that you've been measuring. Should some piece of the puzzle be swapped out? Is something not working well? Is the data that you're using not well targeted to the problem? Is the sharing mechanism not the right approach? How do you go back and kind of determine what's the issue here, and how can you tweak that and keep the ball rolling? So that is our methodology. Like I said, it's one approach. I'm very eager to talk through it with everyone here. I'd love to, both the people on the UNDP side, the other speakers, I'd love to hear the thoughts on this. We're still at a relatively early stage with UNICEF in testing it out, but it seems to be working so far. So we're excited about it. As you have on your flyers here, datacollaboratives.org has the methodology there, as well as resources, examples across all of the different phases. So lots more information there. So thanks a lot.